Today's scripture is from Ecclesiastes, chapter 10, verses 16 through 20 from the Common English Bible. Too bad for you, land, whose king is a boy, and whose princes feast in the morning. Happy is the land whose king is dignified, and whose princes feast at the right time, for energy, not for drunkenness. Through laziness, the roof sags. Through idle hands, the house leaks. Feasts are made for laughter. Wine cheers the living. And money answers everything. Don't curse a king, even in private. Don't curse the rich in your bedroom, because a bird could carry your voice. Some winged creature could report what you said. Thus ends the reading.
Thank you, Susan, for a very dramatic reading. And dear friends, as a preamble here, I need to say something about biblical wisdom literature. That was what we were listening to. Ecclesiastes together with Book of Proverbs and Book of Job, but especially Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. And then there are extra biblical literature like Sirach and so on. I need to say something about it. Friends, it is called wisdom literature, but frankly, it's not always wise. Certainly not from our perspective or from the distance of 2,000 years. Take, for instance, feasts are made for laughter, wine gladdens life, and money meets every need. That's right before that passage I wanted to preach for, so I had no avoiding this passage. And even if we translate, as it is definitely possible, and silver pays for music, just think about how it is. Well, it is honest, it is pragmatic, but is it wise? It certainly leaves strange aftertaste. Just like another pearl of the biblical wisdom literature, those who spare the rod hate their children, and those who love them are diligent to discipline them. Oh, you know, it has been repeated to me when I was a boy, thankfully without that rod on my backside, but that was really that kind of a shift within the culture. And this, what I just read to you, that's actually a sanitized translation. It is much brutal than there. Well, it might be in the Bible, it might be called wisdom, but it is just a collection of sharp, short, witty sayings from 2,000 years ago, or maybe more. Some of it might be amusing, some of it might be revealing. I'm not saying that it is not. But it clearly talks to a different place, different world altogether. Those sayings are clearly complex, diverse, different, and sometimes dated. But some can nevertheless, even though we might not necessarily directly agree with them, offer us very interesting insights, fresh insights, just like that Ecclesiastes 10:20. Even in private, do not abuse the king, and in bedroom, do not make light of the rich. For a bird of the sky can carry the voice, and a birdie might betray every word. You know, it's my translation, and it took me a little while. I shared it with you, like picking hymns sometimes takes as long as preparing the rest of the worship. And sometimes making translation, even one verse, takes a little while. But there is I have here a classical 3-point sermon now, after this preamble. First thing is, surprising realization is behind this. And surprising realization that people were not always reading, praying, or even thinking silently in their heads. Voiceless reading or thinking is surprisingly recent. What we do just regularly, it's relatively recent. In the Bible, Deacon Philip discussed theology, preached Jesus, and baptized Ethiopian eunuch officer because that officer was reading from the scroll of prophet Isaiah. How did Philip know? Because he was reading out loud. That was the common way of reading it. And a few centuries later, St. Augustine wrote in his Confessions, and this is a highly sophisticated intellectual Christian of first centuries. St. Augustine wrote in his Confessions about the surprising ability of his teacher and mentor, St. Ambrose, who was able to read silently. It is difficult to decide precisely when that happened. We can only guess. But widespread silent reading came about at the beginning of modern era. That was the last step of internalization of things in our heads. There were times when people were reading, praying, and even thinking only or predominantly out loud. Frankly, there are vestiges with us until today, and let us be honest with ourselves. Children learn reading out loud. That's the way they learn. Then subvocally, that means like reading, and they are still moving the muscles in their necks, and then teachers are trying to teach them fast reading. That means to decouple that from here. Frankly, for me, I'm now honest with you, I do that in English, subvocal reading probably all the time, because occasionally I will start coughing while reading. That tells you that here it is still had that tendency of moving in my neck. And there are advantages of actually reading this way subvocally, because it causes better memory retention. The way our brains are wired, it is always better. If you want to learn something, just declamate, speak out, speak what you want to say. And that way, you will probably learn that much better than just reading silently. Why should we do it only when we are, and then we do that when we are excited or emotional also? Or upset. That is when we switch into that subvocal or under breath, like even fully vocalized expression like swearing occasionally, or exactly like in our passage, swearing at the king and cursing the rich. And here, as people of faith, we may and should swear at tyrants and curse the egotistic rich. And as spiritual practice, we can even vocalize it in our loud prayers and hymns. Frankly, with what is going on around the world, that there are times when I was swearing at the rich or tyrants in my prayers. And I am giving you full dispensation of doing it, because I think that that is an appropriate spiritual practice, to cry out against injustice, cry out against tyranny, crying out against the death. Like this week when we heard about mobilization in Russia, I wanted to yell out that, because it means that we are in it for much longer, and so many Russian boys will pay for it. Not only Ukrainians. We all know that and sympathize. But the same thing is for the Russian boys. And friends, I've been there myself. I grew up under the regime I did not approve to. And for people like I and my fellow students at the seminary, we were very often sent, I know because the communist regime collapsed before I got to that point, but we were in that position, many of my older friends, that they were sent like a cannon fodder to the front lines, where they knew that they'd always be the first casualty. So those untrusted, like theology students, believe it or not, were used like that. Oh, I got carried away from my sermon, so I should return. Now the second part we need to talk about is the freedom of expression, freedom of speech, which is here. Kind of jeopardized in this saying when you think about it. Where I was born and where I grew up, people could get into a serious trouble by only telling or making a political joke. And Milan Kundera has a whole novel about it called The Joke, how it completely upended the life of a young idealistic socialist. Military occupation of my country in 1968 had to be called brotherly help. Brotherly help. Tanks were rolling through the streets, but it was supposed to be called brotherly help from Soviet people. Just like today, Ukrainian war is to be called special military operation, and those who would call it war, they face consequences under severe penalties. And it went even further. Imagine that many living rooms of Presbyterian pastors in my homeland were bugged in chandeliers. And when a colleague found it and brought it to police saying, I found something illegal, he was so persecuted that in the end was pushed into exile. Important or sensitive matters were discussed only while walking in the park or during long hikes outside. That is the environment of tyranny, when people are afraid to speak their minds, protest injustice, and decry abuse from the powerful and the rich, those kings and rich people. But as people of faith, we should never hesitate in the name of God to protest injustice. And now thirdly, now imagine that you live in the world of Ecclesiastes, a completely interconnected world where everything, even a little bird, can snitch on you. By the way, this was the theoretical underpinning of augury, any kind of divination, but especially in this case, divination from the birds. Everything was connected with everything, and even birds could spill your beans. In such a world, not even a hike or walk in a park would protect your privacy. Think about it. It must have been a crazy world, paranoid world. I'm so thankful for our Jewish and Christian faith, which took first steps away from this magical worldview and from divinations. It must have been so liberating, and it is. We don't need to be scared. And final steps were taken by enlightenment in our world. For a historical moment, we were free, unafraid of speaking our minds, or at least in many parts of the world. But now, think about it. We are dipping again back into that nightmare. Interconnected creation was replaced with ever-present electronic gadgets who can be spying on us even more efficiently than those birds ever could from that magical worldview. Think about it. That is probably why we have so many scared and paranoid and, people around. It is not unreal. Their reactions to it are often strange or crazy, but that is why I love my vacation in the wilderness. In Sonora Desert, bringing water to migrants and helping them to survive. Because we are out of contact from the cell phones. Here I must say at the same time, we are not out of contacts of diligent and ever-present eyes of Border Patrol from their ever-watchful cameras, camera towers and blimps and tripwires and drones flying overhead and helicopters. So, it is as beautiful Sonoran Desert as it is. Very often you feel like being watched even there. Your cell phone might not work, but your every step is marked. But it is the spiritual practice teaching me not to be afraid. We intentionally not swear at the Border Patrol because they will take it out not against us, but against those migrants they might catch. But we are not afraid because what we do in the name of our Lord of compassion. And what we are doing there is only right and just. And therefore, we are not worried about birds betraying it to us, or those blimps over us, or drones spying on us. But to really escape, now I will share with you, and many of you know, I have to go to volcanic wilderness in Hawaii, up in the mountain, in Hawaiian snow. Yes, there is snow there. And we are wearing sweaters. Up in the mountain, air is thin. There is no telephone signal for several days. Cortana, Alexa, or Google, or Facebook cannot spy on us at all. But I could hear birds. Hawaiian honey creepers, iiwi, and apapane, and amakihi. And sometimes I am hearing them even if they are not there. Probably hallucination from thin air. That is for me the real escape from that paranoid, interconnected world of modern technologies and re-embracing an interconnected world of nature. Thus, recognizing deep inside that after all, we are indeed interconnected with those birds and all living creatures, with the entire universe, with the nature. And we don't need to be afraid that they will spill our beans, because what we are doing, what we are living out in that praise of the Lord. And therefore, don't need to be afraid, even if justifiably we curse those who are curseable. And thus, endemic, endangered birds teach me and remind me that if we have faith, we don't need to be afraid to stand up and swear at tyrants and curse the egotistic rich who, for their personal pleasure, endanger our entire interconnected planet. All alive has been always interconnected. It has been created that way. We don't need to be paranoid and afraid if we are on the side of life, if we are on the side of love, if we are on God's side.